Welcome to session 7 of God is Merciful. Jonah chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. So he prayed to the Lord and said, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. Then the Lord said, Is it right for you to be angry? So Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city. There he made himself a shelter and sat under it in the shade till he might see what will become of the city. And the Lord God prepared a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be shade for his head to deliver him from his misery. So Jonah was very grateful for the plant. At odds with an all-knowing, all-seeing God. Why didn't Jonah just go and take a nap or something? Instead, we're about to get a front row seat to his grown-up temper tantrum. Let me just throw this out here. God is not one of your little friends. Let me say that again. God is not one of your little friends. Before you side-eye me, let me explain what I mean. This is a phrase I heard a lot growing up from my mother. Anytime I raised my voice at her in an authoritative tone, or, as though I knew best or better than her. It was a phrase of caution to let me know that I was encroaching upon the line of disrespect and needed to check my attitude before consequences were brought forth. And as you are about to see, God issues a similar phrase of caution to Jonah. Let's head into the verse by verse for Jonah chapter 4. Verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. But anytime you see this conjunction, you're dealing with conflicting actions, thoughts, or ideas. Well, Jonah was guilty of all of that. Okay, well, there are a few limits in translating this text from its original language to English. However, the limits downplay Jonah's state of mind. The original text can actually be translated as, but being evil within exceedingly, he was very angry. Let that sink in. Jonah's emotions put him in direct opposition to God. And here God was repenting of his own planned response to the Ninevites at the end of chapter 3. Jonah, however, is still ready to rain down fire, hell, and brimstone on them. Verse 2. So he prayed to the Lord and said, Lord, was not this, I want to put it in my own words every time there. Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Jonah had the nerve to petition God regarding his complaint against God. Jonah was hot that God hadn't brought down strict punishment on the people of Nineveh. He even blamed God for his own disobedience. Still, he prayed to God about his issues. And in doing so, we learn a lesson about prayer. We can bring anything to God, even our disagreements with his move. And as Jonah does this, he brings up another lesson. Don't let your familiarity with God cause you to think that you and God are on the same level. Jonah said, I know you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. See, Jonah had an issue with the merciful character of God, but only when he felt that the recipient wasn't worthy. But let me tell you something. No, better yet, tell me something. When did Jonah get the power to determine another person's worthiness of God's tender mercy? Since when were we above God to the point that we can say, I know you were going to do that? That's essentially what Jonah's saying here. I knew you were going to do that. I knew, as though he knew better than God. Let's keep going. Verse 3. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. This verse here is dealing with the pride of life. We see the pride of life on full display in Jonah's response. Jonah felt it was better to die than to hear God's heart and see things from God's position. Pride. Pride will have you so full of yourself that you would rather face death than face the outcome. Pride will have you taking matters into your own hands. It will have you stubborn to the point of your own destruction. One could even argue here that Jonah's issue with God showing them mercy was really about how it made him look than anything else. Let that sink in. God's merciful character may have been more about, instead of Jonah just not liking that God is merciful toward this people that Jonah judged as evil, it was more about, it could possibly have been more about how it would look that Jonah was the one that delivered the message to these evil people for them to even be eligible to receive God's mercy. It made him look bad. Think about that. Verses 4. Then the Lord said, is it right for you to be angry? Heed God's questioning. Is it right for you to be angry? The original text here would read more like, does it do you well to be this hot or angered? God was interrogating the heart of Jonah. Have you ever been in a space where the Lord interrogated your heart? Anytime God questions your move, consider it a stop sign. Take a moment to do some true self-reflection before you make another move or say another word. Heed God's warning signs. Remember, I'm not one of your little friends. Again, don't let your familiarity with God cause you to forget that He is sovereign and above everything. You are not on the same level with God. Heed God's warning signs. And I'm hearing a song that comes to mind. You better check yourself before you wreck yourself. Yes. Okay. Let's keep going. So Jonah went out, verse 5, out of the city and sat on the east side of the city. There he made himself a shelter and sat under it in the shade till he might see what would become of the city. The text here does not state that Jonah actually responded to God. Instead, it says that he left the city, sat himself down, and even made himself a little shelter, all so he could wait for God to make good on his word to destroy the Ninevites for their ways. In other words, Jonah felt he was justified in his response. That's nothing more than self-righteousness. Jonah took himself to a high point for better sight. He built himself a temporary shelter and put God on notice that he was waiting for him to move differently. Ooh. Jonah's actions do show one thing. It hadn't yet been 40 days since he delivered the message of God. So that meant he felt that God still had time to do what he said he was going to do. Is this a good time to talk about manipulation? We call what Jonah's doing here emotional manipulation. He ignored God's questioning, stormed off like a grown man. As a grown man, he stormed off like a child who cannot self-regulate their own emotions yet. He storms off and basically crosses his arms while he sits on this hill till God does what he feels, not what God sees and God declares is right, but what Jonah feels is right. Verse 6, and this is our last one for today. And the Lord God prepared a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be shade for his head to deliver him from his misery. So Jonah was very grateful for the plant. Excuse me. From the text, I gathered that this self-made shelter wasn't sturdy. Jonah still had to sit in the shade to keep the sun off of himself. Meanwhile, while he's over here being stubborn and trying to do it all by himself, the Lord made a gourd to cover Jonah's head. Let's look at the true heart of God there. Even in our blatant disobedience and self-righteousness, he is still quick to shield us from harm. And Jonah was grateful, but only for the plant. It's clear that Jonah's anger caused him to have a callous heart. Ooh. God is merciful. Let's stop here for today's session. Jonah is already hot. He's hot inside. He's hot outside. His pride has gotten the best of him, the sun too. And before we finish up this chapter, let's take some time to sit with God and allow him to examine if there's any self-righteousness or pride within us. Because it's easy for us to look at Jonah and disconnect and be like, I would never. And we would talk about what we would want to do. But right now, I'm going to encourage you to pause and begin this process of self-reflection before we begin the next session. And then as you pause here, go back and see how Jonah's story speaks to your heart. Because we're almost at the end of chapter 4. Discussion questions. It is time for those wonderful discussion questions. How would you define pride? If pride and arrogance mean the same thing, how do you feel this impacted Jonah's response? What similarities do you see in 1 Kings 19:4 and Jonah 4 verses 3? What is another way Jonah could have communicated his frustrations or concerns to God? What action of Jonah could be considered manipulation? And now for the point of personal examination, where has pride shown up within me? Where or when have I been guilty of trying to manipulate God's hand in favor of my desired outcome? Meet me back here in Jonah chapter 4, starting at verse 7 for session 8.